Hello, I'm Bill Crowell, President of the Board of Tulsa Metropolitan Ministry and moderator of this series called The Islamic Agenda in Oklahoma. Sharia law is something that scares a lot of people in America, and some legislators have taken it upon themselves to be sure it never comes to their state. Our state of Oklahoma voted by a 70% margin to keep Sharia law from being used in state courtrooms. Was it necessary? Is it a real threat? Today we welcome to our panel Keith McArtor, a lawyer here in Tulsa. Welcome, Keith.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Muneer Awad, Executive Director for the Council on American Islamic Relations here in Oklahoma. Welcome to Muneer.
Thanks for having me.
And Dr. Imad Enchassi from the Islamic Society of Oklahoma City. Welcome again.
Thank you.
Well, Muneer, I'd like to start with you. Tell us, is Sharia law a valid threat to non-Muslim Oklahomans? What do Oklahomans need to know about Sharia?
I would say Sharia is no more of a threat to Oklahomans than any other form of religious law. Not more of a threat than Jewish law or canon law. What Sharia is basically a guidance for Muslims on how to live their lives. It's not a conflicting or a superseding code of laws or a constitution. It's actually a Muslim's engagement and practice within the bounds of our Constitution. It's a Muslim's right to practice their First Amendment rights to freedom of religion, to the practice of their religion. What I think the greater threat is to Oklahomans is the precedent that some of our politicians are trying to create here, where we can actually pick a certain religious community and restrict their First Amendment rights. That's the only threat that I see from this debate surrounding anti-Sharia amendments.
Can you add to that, Dr. Enchassi, just about Sharia? Say a little more about how it's used here in the United States and how other countries seem to be using it.
Well, as Muneer said, there is no sets of laws. When he said the word Sharia, explained in Arabic language, Sharia means a gushing water, a spring of water that keeps on gushing. And Sharia law itself, from the Muslim perspective, is about 95% that changes with time and people and culture to cultures. It is really a set of principle that Muslims live by. So it is very problematic for us when we say when we see the word Sharia being banned. It's basically you're saying we're banning the practice of Islam. That is really that really indicate to us, because if you open any book of Sharia, it would start with how to pray, how to perform a proper wash, and it goes all the way on how to bury people, how people get married, and so on and so forth. It's a vast field that really identifies the very essence of Islam itself.
Well, I mean, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and Native Americans, follow their own religious traditions that don't contradict Oklahoma law. About there are laws about kosher foods. There's laws about wedding contracts. I mean, why shouldn't Muslims? Keith, can you speak to that?
Muslims should be able to have their own practices, and they be respected by the law, because we live in a country that is not supposed to, according to the Constitution, discriminate people on the basis of their religious preferences. That is an absolute constitutional right, and the Supreme Court has been very clear that when the state moves in to prohibit or forbid or in any way to limit the religious beliefs, or at least beliefs, certainly beliefs, and maybe even actions, the state has to have a compelling reason for doing so. Clearly, in this law, State Question 755 and some other one, there is no compelling reason to prohibit Muslims from practicing their faith in the United States. There wasn't even the attempt in this law to put forward a compelling reason. I think that's why the lawsuit Muneer is advocating probably has a very, very good chance of winning, because I don't think the state of Oklahoma can even begin to argue in any rational way that there's a compelling reason to keep Muslims from practicing Sharia law any more than Jews can practice the Torah or the Mishnah, or Roman Catholics can enforce in their own churches canon law or whatever. I mean, there's no difference here. It's remarkable we live in a state that wants to put up the Ten Commandments on courthouse lawns, a part of Torah, the Jewish law, but we want to limit Muslims from exercising their constitutional rights and exercise. I mean, this is a clear case of religious discrimination.
Well, what did the 70% of Oklahomans think that they were preventing by voting no on State Question 755?
Well, I mean, it's arguable anyway. One can at least speculate that what they were thinking, if there was a lot of rational thought going into this, that they were keeping Islamic theocracy from coming to the United States of America. Even the Daily Oklahoman says this law is just utterly unnecessary.
Wow.
And that's they were against it. And say what you want to about the Daily Oklahoman, but they're generally a pretty conservative newspaper. And when the Daily Oklahoman comes along and says, "Don't pass this law; it's going to do more harm than good. It's unnecessary," but it's difficult, I think, when people get afraid to make them reason and listen to facts. And I think there's just a lot of fear. I don't think they were thinking as much as they were just reacting out of fear that they're somehow afraid, and they've been made to be afraid by, I have to say it, ministers and politicians and radio talk show hosts and people like that who, for their own political purposes to gain power and keep it, they have to pick a group of people to demonize just so that they can, gain power and keep it. And right now, the people who are chosen are Muslim folks, I'm sure, in the wake of 911 and all that. So I think it's more fear than it is anything else.
Right. I would say it's not so much as what they were thinking, more so than what they were told to think about it. And this really had a successful campaign of misinformation about what Sharia was, about what Muslims were about. And these people were led to believe that, again, we're looking at an amendment that was titled the Save Our State Amendment. They were told about this looming threat of a creeping Sharia, a threat to the Judeo-Christian values of the state, and is just inaccurate and misinformed, because Judeo-Christian values, as Muslim can tell you, are actually Muslim values. The Abrahamic faiths, these are Abrahamic values that Muslims believe in as well. There was nothing incompatible about Sharia or Islam and the values that we hold dear in Oklahoma. So what we had was a campaign that was funded by a number of organizations and endorsed by politicians that saw the benefit in marginalizing and targeting a minority community, demonizing them, and then reaping the benefits, in this case, political benefits of doing that. And a lot of Oklahomans were misinformed. I don't think they actually had the ill intent of demonizing and targeting the Muslim community. But if you watched a lot of the newspaper ads or watched the commercials on TV or the debates on TV, Oklahomans were led to believe that there was a serious threat. And we really can't blame people that would have no reason to know better. But it's the people that did know better, the politicians that did know better, the ones that knew that Sharia was not a threat to Oklahoma, the ones that knew that it was impossible for some type of Islamic law to take over our courts, yet they willfully and deliberately misinformed our voters. I think the greater question is, what were they thinking? What were the leaders of this campaign thinking?
Exactly. And there was a full-page ad taken out, was there not, in one of the papers? Was it the Daily Oklahoman? Or
when he say well-funded, I mean, actually, my wife received a call. There was a recording being called, if you don't vote for 755, you're going to be abused as a woman in Oklahoma. There's going to be lashes being inflicted on you, and so on and so forth. The campaign was very well funded. There was newspaper ads, the call-in of the voters a week before the vote, citing an overturned case that happened somewhere in New Jersey. And really, there are those people who thought they were coming out to vote for that question to save their state. The politics of fear, as has been mentioned here, brings people to the poll, and that was the aim of that.
What's happening around the country since all this has happened and the lawsuit has taken place? Are states still Are things unfolding
Right.
around the country still, too?
Unfortunately, the lawsuit that has stopped this amendment from taking force in Oklahoma didn't have the effect we would like to think it would have had. There's actually been an effort to ban Sharia in many other states. Some states have gone as far as making practicing Sharia a crime, punishable by prison time. This is a proposal in Tennessee. Some states have basically made identical bans, one in South Dakota. And other states are realizing that it is unconstitutional to target one religious faith, one religious tradition, and they've tried to, in a way that they see as clever, do the same thing without saying it directly in the amendment. And what we're seeing is that the same organizations that campaigned and funded the Sharia scare in Oklahoma are actually moving on to other states. So we have politicians, even in Oklahoma, that aren't even coming up with these bills on their own. They're actually being handed these bills by organizations that are promoting this anti-Muslim bigotry. They're being handed these bills by these organizations, and they're putting them on their House floor. We have a representative in Oklahoma that's going for the second attempt to ban Sharia now. Representative Sally Kern has recently been working with the Center for Security and Policy, an organization run by a well-known anti-Muslim bigot, who has basically handed her an amendment, and now it's on our floor, House Bill 1552, to ban foreign laws. They talk about banning Sharia, but the amendment doesn't specifically ban Sharia. However, they say this is the fix to the State Question 755 problem. So unfortunately, we've seen, despite knowing better, despite seeing the religious community get targeted and demonized, the political benefit is still there. And unfortunately, Islamophobia is politically popular today, and a lot of politicians are trying to maximize the opportunity they have to attack Muslims and gain popularity from their constituents.
And, you know, I might just say, I think it's very interesting that Representative Kern has offered this new bill by which outlaws judges, I would imagine, taking cognizance in Oklahoma of any, quote, international law, but she has excised all references to Sharia law, which it seems to me is probably an admission on her part and their part that they went too far in 755 by putting Sharia law in there, because I think they're probably facing, you know, a certain defeat in the courts, because it's clearly facially unconstitutional. But I think Muneer is right that what they're doing is they're trying to get in through the back door what they couldn't do in the front door, and by this, you know, banning of international law, which is just also foolish on the face of it.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, how states and federal laws, and can states supersede federal law? And vice versa. I mean, how does that happen?
The general rule in our country, according to the Constitution, is Article 6. There's a clause in there called the Supremacy Clause, which says that any law that is passed by the United States Congress, by the federal government, and is consistent with the Constitution, that includes federal statutes, treaties, and that kind of thing, is the supreme law of the land. And that means that any state and local laws that run up against that supreme law are by definition unconstitutional. That article goes on to state that state judges, despite what anything else may say, are bound to follow the laws of the United States government and the Constitution. So that's the basic relationship between federal and state law. I mean, there you know, some exceptions here and there, but as a general rule, if the federal government doesn't occupy the field, states can do whatever they want to do. But when it comes to a federal issue, then obviously the United States federal government laws supersede state laws. That's our system of government. It's our federalist system of government. And what's interesting is that when this country enters into a treaty with another country, the president signs it, it's approved by the United States Senate, it becomes United States law, and it becomes the supreme law of the land. So I'm not sure exactly what State Question 755 or Representative Kern's issue is going to be when an Oklahoma corporation doing business with a German corporation, and there's some kind of commercial, you know, dispute, a breach of contract or whatever, and a treaty comes into play to be interpreted, and that treaty implies and encodes some German law, which now is a part of the deal. I guess the Oklahoma judge is not supposed to is not supposed to recognize it or enforce it or whatever, well, he or she would then be in violation of the oath he or she took when he or she took office to uphold the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution. Now, I mean, it doesn't take a first-year law student to work through these problems. So, I mean, I'm not really sure, get back to your question about what they were thinking, but I think it goes back to what Muneer is thinking.
Right.
There's no effort here to protect against anything real. There's no specter out there. There's no substantive concern. This is a power grab. Of course, that's what politics is a power grab. But here, what they're doing it by demonizing a whole group of people based upon their national origin, based upon their race, and based upon their religious faith. And that's what makes it unconstitutional, and that's what makes it un-American. And if we don't fight it here, then today it's the Muslims, tomorrow, who knows who it may be.
Imad?
I just want to bring some simple terms, how that would affect me personally. Banning international law and so on and so forth, people don't realize that if somebody's married in Canada, their marriage license might be no longer valid. The point we argued is, as Muslims, when somebody passes away, they would write a will. And the will, most of the time, is based on Islamic law. If I want half my inheritance to go to my wife, 1/3 to my children, and so on and so forth, it's a very it's a formula that has been predetermined. And before we were able to do that and write our will according to Islamic law, which is proportioned according to what the Islamic law have said. Now, if we are to file that will with the state of Oklahoma, the judge have no choice but to carry our will. But if that law passes, banning Sharia law, so anything that's based on Sharia law, including my will be no longer valid. That's on an individual level.
Sure.
And measure many things, marriages that is done in the mosque by the Imam. I even argued, can I be, I'm an expert witness on many cases. Can the judge even listen to me now since I am a Muslim or I'm an Imam? It opens a can of worms that is unbelievably going to be costly to taxpayers. At the same time, it really infringes on individual rights per se, every individual rights per se, and Muslims in particular, because it did name a holy prophet in the 755 named Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. It did name Islam. It did name our holy book. And I don't believe there was any religion ever been attacked or an amendment against any religion was put with those premises on it. So in simple terms, really it's saying that you could leave your will any way you like it, but I can't, simply because your faith is different than my faith. And that is, again, I'm not a lawyer, but this is a direct violation of the First Amendment, including mentioning a holy man by name, a holy scripture by name, and the name of my faith by name. That is very dehumanizing and demonizing.
I think some good points that were just brought up is, in an attempt to demonize and harm the Muslim community, in effect, they're actually harming the entire Oklahoma community. The ban on international and foreign laws, I mean, this is a business's right to enter into a contract. We have a number, thousands of international companies that have operations in Oklahoma, and thousands of Oklahoma businesses that have international operations. All you have to do is ask yourself, what international company would want to invest in a state that would find an international agreement or contract as unenforceable? No one's going to want to invest in the state. So in an attempt to combat a non-existent threat, what we've had is politicians create real and actual threats to our state.
And those politicians, by the way, I might add, made it very clear to the media their motive behind State Question 755. And they did mention the growth of Islam and the threat of Islamization of the state of Oklahoma, where we are less than 1% of the state population. They made it very clear on many media outlets that their intention behind that law is to prevent some form of a Muslim takeover of the state legislation or so on and so forth, which brings us back to the politics of fear.
Yes.
It really does. I mean, it is just amazing to think that if a first-year law student could have figured out this has no basis, and yet it makes it all the way through to a state question that I had to vote on. I mean, that is incredible that fear has that much power in our society.
In the last number of years, the state legislature of Oklahoma has passed some laws that were so facially unconstitutional that when they were appealed to the state Supreme Court, our state Supreme Court, in a couple of opinions in about the last 18 months, has taken to task publicly in written opinions the state legislature of our state for passing laws that they well knew could not stand a constitutional test and would be ruled unconstitutional, but they did it anyway for political reasons, thus, as you fellows have said, wasting everybody's time, wasting resources, putting the state in a bad light, putting the Supreme Court in a position where they have to make a ridiculously easy decision by, saying something's unconstitutional when they shouldn't even be in that position. I mean, this is unprecedented that our own state Supreme Court has had to do this. But in democracy, you get the government, I guess, that you deserve. And it's our people. I mean, and I understand it's the leaders. The leaders are doing this to get their own power. But at some point, the people of this state have got to live out the faith they say they have. And instead of being afraid to have faith and to have hope and to have courage and to think and to love their brother and to love their neighbor, and everyone is our neighbor, and to live out the faith they say they have, so that we can have the kind of state that everybody says they want. But as long as we're willing to knuckle under to politicians who are willing to do the kinds of things that we're talking about, we're going to get this kind of
and in the court, we were in the court. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but the judge would ask the question 3 times: what is the aim or the purpose of this law? And the state have really no answer. 3 times, what is the aim and the purpose of this law? And the state would answer really very vaguely, is to prevent religious law from, and the judge would say, did this ever happen? Well, no. So what's the aim of the law? And really, the government side or the state side was so many times overruled in the court. I felt really, if I was the lawyer representing the state, I would be humiliated. They were every single time, I think it was 17 times, overruled by the federal judge. Very simple statement, very obvious discrimination to even my kid who's 11 years old. He would say, "Dad, why would they mention my faith in an amendment?" And to think that this amendment was authored by lawyers is really annoying.
Yes. I would say I think a lot of the attention that we've got afterwards with the lawsuit and with Oklahomans just wanting to find out more, wanting to know what the fuss is about, has led to this greater education. I mean, the work we do at the Council on American Islamic Relations is about education. It's about advancing the understanding of Islam and creating interfaith dialogue. And we found many people who have been receptive, many people who admittedly said, I really wasn't sure what this is about, but it just made obvious sense to vote for it. Of course I want to save my state. Of course I don't want to be ruled under Islamic law. This is what a lot of people thought. But the attention has allowed us the exposure and opportunity to sort of reach out and talk to these people. As you mentioned, the Muslim community of Oklahoma is less than 1% of the population here. The percentage of those people who are registered voters is even far lesser than that. And we still had about 30% of Oklahomans vote against this amendment. So we knew that there are people out there that did know better, and what we're finding now is we're finding many people who have realized that this was unconstitutional. This did target the Muslim community. It was easy to attack Sharia and the representations of what Sharia is by a lot of these anti-Muslim groups. But when Muslims were telling them, wait, I practice Sharia when I pray, I practice Sharia when I marry, I practice Sharia when I do all these everyday things that every
when I pay my charity.
Exactly.
Exactly.
That's when Oklahomans started to realize, you know, maybe there is something wrong with this, and we have started to see people begin to change points of view on what this amendment is about and what the Muslim community is about.
Because Sharia is for Muslims. Sharia is for Muslims, and it's not meant to be for Christians and Jews and all the rest. Correct?
Yeah, that's what I understand.
Absolutely. I mean, Islamic law will govern Islamic Muslims, and even if there's a Sharia law, those who are not of the Islamic faith, that does not apply to them. Yet, some of the recordings would say if 755, you know, will not pass, they're going to be lashing, and they're going to be caning and cutting off the head and so on and so forth. It was extremely ugly.
And I think even furthermore, just as all other forms of religious arbitration or religious law, even Muslims can choose not to have Sharia govern their lives in America. This has to be consenting individuals that actually seek a religious arbitration or actually engage in a religious contract or a religious agreement or any agreement that involves some form of need for religious definition or interpretation. Our courts actually endorse and support for religious arbitration. The courts cannot take a role in defining what a religious tradition is. So state courts and federal courts actually encourage people to engage in religious arbitration when there is a conflict with respect to a religious issue, and then the court simply enforce that arbitration. So even Muslims have to agree to be contractually obligated to follow some form of Sharia.
Could I make a point here? I think it's important when it comes to the First Amendment to realize that our law makes a distinction to a certain extent between religious beliefs and religious behaviors. Okay, religious beliefs are a form of free speech, and so they're absolutely protected. Religious behaviors can be limited by the law, according to the Supreme Court. The famous case of American Indians smoking peyote during religious services. The Supreme Court ruled in a famous case, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, something like that, that was not a protected activity under the First Amendment because the state had an overriding interest in protecting people from the harmful effects of drug usage. Folks can't, in a worship service, expose their children to poisonous snakes, okay, under the First Amendment. If the state says you can't do that, you can't use the First Amendment to do that. And so, I mean, I suppose there may be a fear out there that Muslims would, you know, in this country would somehow, under Sharia law, make it possible to do horrifying or inhumane things to people, I suppose, because of, you know, what they hear from maybe other places in the world or whatever. I don't know. But those kinds of things would not be permissible under state law. And so that shouldn't be a concern, even if there was a desire to do those kinds of things, which I know there's not. But it would not be permissible under state law. The problem is you have so many people who actually believe in this state that these folks here are wanting to establish an Islamic theocracy in the United States that would do away with all of our constitutional rights and our law and set up some kind of, I don't know, Iranian Ayatollah moving into the governor's mansion.
That's what they said about Kennedy. If Kennedy would win,
that's right.
The Pope will be at the White House.
That's right.
Politics of fear, McCarthyism at its best.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Right. And there were a lot more Catholics in 1960 than there are Muslims in Oklahoma in 2011.
Exactly.
So anyway, but you're exactly right. It's all about fear, and it's all about inspiring people out of fear to secure their own lives, but it's always at the expense of people who, interestingly enough, are always in the minority, because it's always easy for bullies to beat up.
And I don't think we can emphasize it enough, but just to mention again that symbiotic connection between our Constitution and Islamic law. Not only are people of any faith not allowed to engage in a practice that's illegal or unconstitutional, but in the case of Sharia as well, one of the main aspects of Sharia is respecting the law of your land. So as Muslims, we are actually mandated to follow the law of our land. So not only is it illegal for us to do things that are against our Constitution, but religiously, we also believe we can't do things to offend the law of the land.
That's a very good point.
That's an excellent
I
point.
think that a lot of people don't understand, and I'm aware too of the lack of education, in some cases just the ignorance of our own system of government, how it runs, because I was a history major in college, and so I had to study all these things, and of course many of us had civics classes and this kind of thing, and how bills get through, and this lack of understanding, or it just has grown over time, it seems, but and then add that to the fear, put those two together and target a minority. I mean, it's just I'm like you. I'm just flabbergasted as to what can be put on the floor of a legislature.
But it does give us, let's say it this way, it gives us an opportunity to do what CAIR is doing, and to do what you're doing in mosques, and to do what Tulsa Metropolitan Ministry is doing, and OCCJ and other organizations, to educate, because that is the best thing, I think, for us to do. There are a lot of folks out there, and Muneer said it right, that they didn't know. I mean, they're ignorant. They're not stupid, and they don't have bad faith, and they don't have bad hearts. They're just ignorant, and so if we can educate, if they can meet folks and have fellowship with folks, and they realize these are good folks, these are good folks. I like these folks, Then the fear, begins to go away a little bit, and then people can see through this for what it is. So I really applaud your efforts.
Well, part of the Islamic Sharia law is a verse said, "Repel evil with good." Yes. Despite all the hate crime and hate messages and emails, we answered every single email, and we took people out to lunch. And when they saw us, one person came out to lunch with me who have actually left me a package at my house. I could have called the feds, but I chose to practice my Sharia law, and we invited him to lunch. He was so scared. His son said, "You're going to go out with the Imam to eat lunch?" And we went and had lunch. And Jim is one of my best friends. He came to Friday prayers. I went to church with him. And that is practicing Sharia law. If somebody would like to know, repelling evil with good, this is what the Quran says. And it says, when you repel evil with good, you see that person that have most animosity towards you becomes your dearest friend. And that's what really we have been practicing.
See, this is wonderful here, because in the Christian scriptures we have a verse that says, "Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." So, I mean, this is one of those many places where the Abrahamic faiths are in agreement, and it's the most important places oftentimes, when it comes to civil and collective things that we have agreement on. This is the kind of thing that has to get out, and I think that if it does, that we have a better chance of overcoming some of the prejudice and fear that is there. We're not going to reach everybody, but I mean, you reached one person. And to reach one person is like to reach the world, because that one knows how many other, 100, 1,000, and he can go out and say, "Hey, it's not what you think," and that's what we need to do.
It is, no doubt. So there are some out there who want to talk about all the violence that they see on television, and they'll ask, now, why don't Muslims condemn that violence? Why don't we see that? How would you answer that?
Gee, I never heard that before. We have in many strong languages. If you go on the internet, from national Muslim organization, Islamic Society of North America, Islamic Circle of North America, Council on American Islamic Relations, we have. Sometimes the response was immediate, and sometimes the response was not immediate. I think I always tell people the story that when 9/11 happens, for instance, I am the leader in Oklahoma City. I was in my house. I thought I was watching a movie. By the time I need to get to my office, we were bombarded by people pointing the finger at us. We were bombarded by federal authorities questioning us, questioning our very principles, questioning our American identity. Do you know those people? Have you seen this? So there was a fear in some smaller communities, especially in Oklahoma. There was a fear, and we know from psychology when somebody's scared, their actions might not be immediate. But national organization went ahead online and in many different various groups have mentioned and condemned terrorism in all languages. But sometimes people don't seem to see that. And when people are motivated, sometimes when there's a hate factor, I call it, people seem to be not seeing things in the proper lenses. For believers, no proof is necessary. For a disbeliever, no proof is possible sometimes. But it is out there. It is out there. It's been out there from day one. And some communities did not respond immediately. For God's sake, the President of the United States did not respond immediately because he was scared and he was taken to a secret place. And to blame some of the communities for not responding immediately, we were more scared than anyone else. Actually, I always tell the people, I said, we were not given the same, where other fellow Americans were grieving, we did not have that feeling of grief because we were scared. Our mosque was, federal authorities were at mosques. Federal leaders were visited often, questioned often. Children who were in school, were asked. Wives were asked, and it continued, a pattern that continued, which we have worked through it with the federal authorities and so on and so forth. They know who we are, and we were certainly ready to help in any way and form. But there is that statement, and it came out almost immediately after any act of violence. Not only act of violence against Islam and Muslims, but even act of violence. The last, Congress lady was shot, and there was also a condemnation of that violence as well.
And I would say even on our website, CAIROklahoma.com, on the main homepage, we have a link to document all the condemnations of terrorism and violence by the American Muslim community. It's a long list, a very long list, a huge file, PDF file. But like Imam mentioned, there are some people who ask that question without the best intention. They're asking it without doing much investigation themselves. And oftentimes we just have to sit back and think and say, wait a minute. What we're saying is that the Muslim community is inherently evil or inherently predetermined to engage in violence. So as a Muslim, prove to me that you're not. And I think that's really an unfair assumption to make. And Muslims, as people of all faiths, are not people who condone or support violence. We, just as people of other faiths, again, are peaceful and support peace and support compelling evil with good. But again, you have that underlying assumption that I think is to an extent unfair. But despite that, the Muslim community still makes its best efforts. Every time there is an act like this, the Muslim community feels compelled, whether rightful or not, to come out and condemn this violence, and we do. And we just have to consider the fact that a lot of the violence we see, whether it be on TV, not only the news, not only the media, but also many of our TV shows, our sitcoms, our movies, tend to portray Muslims in a light that suggests that Muslims are inherently violent. And the truth of the matter is that an extreme minority, a very extreme minority of Muslims, tend to earn the majority of the coverage in American media and American television. So these extreme minority ideas that does not reflect the vast majority of Muslims tends to be portrayed as a representation of what Muslims are about. So when people see something that is violent or negative about Islam, they look at the majority of Muslims who are not violent and who condemn violence and condemn terrorism and ask, well, why aren't you standing against this? And I think we just have to remember that narrative every time we hear that question. But for those who don't want to accept that narrative, again, just go to our website, CAIROklahoma.com, and right on the main page, we have a link that goes to all the condemnations against terrorism and violence by American Muslim organizations.
Very good.
Well said. Well said. I wonder if you could even describe the Christian's existence in Muslim countries. Is it safe to live and practice there? I'm sure you haven't heard that question either before, but is there, Christians that live elsewhere in Muslim countries, are they welcomed there? Are they Are there places where they're not?
Absolutely. Half my family is Christian. It is really ironic sometimes. You see that a Muslim is mandated by their faith to kill the Jews and the Christians, and it's really sometimes I kind of have to back up and look at it. And we haven't been living by our faith mandate, because millions of Christians live in the Middle East, and I might point out to a lot of people sometimes that that's where Christianity started. Right. Jesus right. is from Nazareth, and Nazareth is in Palestine, right. What is known as Israel now. I come from Lebanon. Just to back up a little bit, a lot of time people would point the finger at, look what Muslims do in Saudi Arabia, look what Muslims do in Lebanon, look what Muslims do in, well, I pay taxes to the state of Oklahoma, and I pay taxes to the federal government. I am a U.S. citizen, and many of us were born and raised here. We are Americans, so we have no say-so of anything that goes on in a different part of the world. A lot of those demonstrations, you see people sometimes demonstrating hatefully against Muslims gatherings, and we have signs, go back home. You know, my son would say, Lubbock, Texas. You know, I'm an OU Sooner fan. So the notion sometimes people ask us about, well, the Christians are not treated well in the Muslim world. Right. Neither are the Muslims sometimes. If you see the news right now, you'll see the Muslims themselves are trying to revoke those evil government in some instances, and trying to spread democracy and freedom and so on and so forth. If people want to tell me how Christians are treated in the Muslim country, I'm going to point out how many Muslims are in jail also as well, who love freedom, who wants freedom of speech and freedom of religion and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, sometimes the bad stories do sell. If it bleeds, it reads. Simply, we see a church being bombed, for example, in Egypt, but the second week when the Muslims would come pray right outside the church and create a human shield to protect their brothers who are the Christians, that does not make the news. Very, very little people would hear about it. Sure. The Christians live in perfect harmony with the Muslims. As a matter of fact, a story my father tells me, my father's from Jerusalem, he said, the keys for the Church of Resurrection is in a hand of a Muslim family that had that key. They open it every morning, they close it every night, and the keys for the mosque in Jerusalem is in the hand of a Christian family. And that traditionally, when the Muslims had a feud among themselves, they would bring the father to come fix the problem, and when the Christians denomination would have friction, they bring the Imam to come fix the problem, because he's a neutral figure. Sure. Throughout history, you could see the history of Spain, where Muslim and Jews and Christian lived in perfect harmony. All this technology we are enjoying nowadays comes from the golden era of Spain, where Muslims and Christians and Jews lived in perfect harmony, and they produced so much technology for us that we are reaping the benefits up to this day. Is there some isolated incidents? Absolutely. Is there some isolated incidents of Muslims also being victimized in the Muslim world? Oh, plenty.
And I would even go as far to say the questions are great, and I'm sure these are questions that many people have. But again, we have to look at the narrative and the framework behind this question. And many times, for instance, we're talking about State Question 755 and anti-Sharia bans. This question comes up in a way to say, wait, Muslim countries don't respect Christianity. Why should we respect Islam? And I just really think we have to sit back and look at that. I was born and raised in America. I'm an American Muslim, as American as American can be. I mean, for me to think for 1 second that we are looking at foreign countries to determine how we apply our laws is in a way ridiculous. I mean, the United States Constitution is a beacon of light to governments around the world. Many new countries look to the United States Constitution to get an idea of how to craft something similar. And the United States Constitution has something that many of these Muslim countries don't have. And that's the Bill of Rights, and that's the First Amendment, and that's the protection to practice your religion freely. And that's something we don't have to look at foreign countries in order to understand how to apply and analyze. Many times we hear politicians such as Newt Gingrich, most famously, who will say, you know, I can't build a church in Mecca. You know, why should we allow Muslims to build a mosque in New York? And I just have to say, you know, how false is this premise to start with? I mean, since when has the United States began to look at how Saudi Arabia applies its laws in order to understand how to apply laws to its own citizens? But if we're going to dig for further roots, I mean, my parents originally are from Palestine, are from the West Bank. We come from a city that's next door neighbors to a Christian city, the Taiba. And not only do we live in harmony with Christians, but we actually respect their schools much more than our own schools. I have nephews and nieces in the West Bank that go to Christian schools. So there is a harmony there. There is a neighborly feeling. And through my visits overseas, I've been to Israel and Palestine many times. I would say the 3 best visits I have are in 3 cities that have Muslims, Jews, and Christians in it: Nazareth, Bethlehem, and Jerusalem. You find Christians and Muslims and Jews living in harmony overseas. This assumption, this blanket assumption that somehow Christians don't have the same rights as Muslims in the Muslim world is just false. We have to look at maybe there's instances that people point to, but overall, from your panelists at least, you would see that we have a history with Christians and Muslims in the same areas, in the same countries, that are afforded the same rights as any other person would have.
You know, we live in a community in which Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, folks of all faith or no faiths, in Oklahoma City too, cooperate well in interreligious dialogue and interfaith activities, in government, whatever, because we know each other. We work with each other. We see each other at meetings. We sit down and we have dinner with each other, and so we respect each other. That's why we have got not to let poisonous, toxic politicians who get all this unearned social power, really, and unearned time on television and radio, punch all the buttons that we know are wrong. And I just want to say this. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's a Muslim country or, quote, Christian country or whatever. Whenever you have too much political and economic power in the hands of too few people, there is going to be persecution. There's going to be an abuse of that power. There is nothing unique about that in the hands of Muslims or Christians or Jews. That's just a human trait. And that's why our founding fathers wrote a document that dispersed power among different peoples and different branches of government and that kind of thing, because they knew that if you didn't do that, that there was going to be persecution. So for folks to say, well, there's something inherently oppressive about Muslim countries, they haven't read a page of history. I mean, you and I are Christians. Mm-hmm. I mean, we could go back not too far in this country's history, right at the very beginning of our country, in which Christian governments, too much power in their hands, yes, did some horribly inhumane things to people. And we could go back thousands of years in which Christians did that to Jews, and they did to Muslims and to other people too. They didn't do it because they were Christians. They did it because they were human beings driven by power, and they had too much power in their hands. And
they claimed inspiration from faith.
Oh well,
certainly, they did. And I think also of just in our own history, World War II, the Japanese-American experience, yes, when they were rounded up and put in these camps. I mean, the same kind of fear and the names and all the kinds of things that I'm hearing today, mm-hmm, that having read that history is, mm-hmm, so similar, and it's mm-hmm, and we don't learn well from our history. We don't follow our history. We don't know our history often, mm-hmm, and it's a problem.
Right. But and again, in another light, we've seen it happen with other minorities. We've seen the Jewish community go through hard times, yes, in America. Mm-hmm. Yes. We've seen the Catholic community go through hard, mm-hmm, times. Many times the Muslim community, right? The
Irish community.
Right now, the Muslim community and organizations like CAIR see this as a trial and an obstacle. But we're very fortunate to be part of a tradition to where we've seen these trials overcome. And we're hopeful that this is what it is. I know you mentioned earlier this is an opportunity, and we're hopeful that people will see this as an opportunity, mm-hmm, an opportunity that Muslims can embrace in order to help define their faith better. There's a gap in many areas, and Muslims can help in this, and that's what the work of CAIR is about. We're about trying to get out there and help educate people. The opportunity has come. Muslims have been targeted. Muslims have been demonized. But this is an opportunity to educate people about Islam as well.
And
Go, please.
We have a segment that we have forgotten actually sometimes to talk about is 37% of the Muslims in the United States are African American who've been victimized once. And now being African American and being a Muslim, they have a double victimized. An African American Muslim Imam would tell me, he said, back in the 60s, I could not, I have to sit in the back of the bus. As I'm African American Muslim now, I cannot even get on the bus, as his way of showing humor that reflects the pain within. Those people were born and raised, and indigenous people in the United States. Many converts are within our faith, from people from all over the states to people who are born and raised, from immigrant. If we really look really deep, maybe the difference between us and some other people is when their father came to this country, maybe 2, 3, 4 generations ago. His father happened to be first-generation immigrant. I happened to be a first-generation immigrant that believed in something called freedom of religion. Isn't that what the great people who wrote the Constitution came for? Isn't that what the Mayflower was?
Sure,
freedom of religion. And it seems like sometimes we violate that, but there's always a system and a principle that we look up to that it will fix that injustices.
And there is. And despite all of our struggles in this country, we have come so far in the United States of America with African Americans and women and minorities of all kinds and religious groups of all kinds. And so, the great line of Thomas Jefferson before he died, the eyes of the world are opened or are opening to the rights of people everywhere. And as long as we keep that beacon in front of us, then we're all working, towards something that I think is on the right side of history and will prevail despite some very long struggles.
Well, it seems the courts are a very, very important place to work this out. Certainly for the civil rights movement.
Absolutely.
It very much was a place, and the hope is, I know, Supreme Court justices get placed, political decisions get made on who gets placed there. So it's not a perfect system, but it certainly is a place I think we can turn again. So I'm grateful. That's why we have 2 lawyers sitting here today. And,
well, it's always been our courts really that have been the vanguard and have paved the way to the enforcement of these constitutional rights, and thank the Lord for them, because otherwise, unfortunately, too much popular democracy doesn't work for all the reasons that we've just talked about. And so, but we have a system of law and constitutions and courts that we can take advantage of, and that's why I admire and applaud your lawsuit, and I have every conviction that you're going to win.
You just mentioned women and African Americans.
Yes.
And the judge who gave us the ruling is a woman and is African American.
Yes.
That
really?
Apparently she worked. She was appointed by President Clinton, and she knows what discrimination is all about.
Yes, she does.
And that is, a perfect example of how the system works sometimes.
Absolutely.
We're coming toward the end of our time. Is there anything else that you all would like to say? Just an issue maybe that we've missed around this topic? We said some very, very good things.
Right. I would just stick in there again. I don't think we can emphasize it enough. The need to become better informed with what our politicians are doing. We're all very confident in our court system. We're all confident in the American tradition and the history behind the rights of minorities, and we understand legally this will play itself out in a positive way in accordance to our Constitution. But we really need the public, as much as we'd hate to say it, but at this moment, the court of public opinion actually matters a bit more than the court of law. for the Muslim community who has been demonized and attacked and targeted because of this. We have children in schools that are going through problems with bullies now because of what's being said about their faith. We have people in the workforce that are being discriminated against. We have a lot of foreign policy. A lot of the popularity and the support for some of our policies overseas come from a lack of information about what Islam is. So I think this really is an opportunity for all of us to sort of reach out and become better informed with what Islam is, what Sharia is, what American Muslims are about. Not to look at the government of Iran or Saudi Arabia to try and define what Islam is, but we have Muslim neighbors that you can actually talk to about what Islam is. We have Muslim doctors, bus drivers, taxi drivers. So we really need to work on convincing and educating the public at large about the part of the American fabric that the Muslim community comprises of.
And I would say for folks in this environment, in this state, it's incumbent upon our Muslim friends to work as hard as they're working. But, you know, we are the host community in a sense. We are the majority group. Here I am, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I mean, we're like the core. I've never suffered a shred of discrimination in my life based upon my gender, my race, or my religion. And so it is incumbent upon those of us who have been so privileged, more than we can ever imagine, to educate ourselves about the workings of our government and to live out what we say our faith is. And that is, don't fear, have hope. Perfect love casts out fear. Reach out to our neighbors. Get out of our homes and out of ourselves and off the computer. Read books, read the Constitution, get out. Go to places, meet people that we don't know who are not like us, different religious faiths, get to know them, work for the common good with them so that we can begin to develop a more civil discourse, because otherwise we are not going in the right direction. And unless we, the people, do something about that in our little places in the world, we're going to reap a bitter time as a result of it. So it's up to us, and we have the power to do it, and we must do it.
Well, on that, we will close. So I appreciate Keith.
Thank you for having me.
Muneer,
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a very good conversation, and I hope certainly more education can be done. Say again your website.
CAIROklahoma.com. People can actually also follow us on Facebook and Twitter if they want to see about events we're hosting in the community or events we're a part of. We posted this event on Facebook and Twitter. So there's plenty of ways to follow us, and hopefully we can have some people that aren't familiar with us show up at some of our events and gatherings in Oklahoma.
And CAIR is spelled C-A-I-R. Right. CAIR. So thank you so much for joining us.